Follow the money, they said. What we found shocked the entire neighborhood. I inherited 1,500 acres that everyone in my family called worthless. A broken ranch, a neglected reservoir. Miles of empty Wyoming land nobody wanted. Then the president of a luxury HOA showed up with lawyers, threats, and county complaints, acting like she owned the valley. What she didn't know was that my late uncle left behind something far more valuable than land. Hidden inside decades of forgotten records was a truth that could shake an entire community. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized this fight was never about fences, property values, or an old ranch. It was about who really owned the ground beneath their feet. If you enjoy stories where ordinary people stand their ground with patience, evidence, and a little old-fashioned grit, make sure you're subscribed. This one only gets crazier from here. The day I inherited 1,500 acres in Wyoming, I honestly thought my life had finally found a new way to kick me while I was down. 6 months earlier, my wife had walked away with most of what we'd built together. The divorce left me with debt, a cramped apartment outside Cheyenne, and a mechanic shop that was barely staying afloat. At 48 years old, I spent most mornings wondering how many bad breaks a man could take before he stopped getting back up. Then a lawyer called. "Mr. Mercer, your Uncle Russell named you as sole beneficiary of his estate." I almost laughed. Uncle Russell Mercer had been the family legend nobody talked about. He'd lived alone for decades on a ranch somewhere in western Wyoming. Most relatives considered him stubborn, eccentric, and impossible to deal with. I hadn't seen him in nearly 15 years. "What exactly did he leave me?" I asked. The lawyer paused. "Approximately 1,500 acres. That sounded impressive until he added the next part. "The property hasn't generated income in years." 3 days later, I loaded my pickup and headed west. The farther I drove, the emptier the world became. Cell service disappeared. Traffic disappeared. Even the billboards vanished. By late afternoon, I rolled through a rusted gate hanging crooked on broken hinges. Beyond it stretched miles of neglected pasture and sagebrush. The ranch house sat on a low rise overlooking a reservoir that looked half abandoned. My first thought was simple. Nobody in their right mind would pay money for this place. The house needed work. The fences needed work. The reservoir looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. Everything needed work. I parked beside the house and climbed out. The silence hit me immediately. No neighbors, no traffic, no apartment walls, no shouting. Just wind moving through dry grass and the distant creak of an old windmill. For the first time in months, my chest felt lighter. Maybe the place was worthless. Maybe I couldn't afford to keep it. But standing there, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the divorce. Peace. The next few days were spent exploring. The property seemed endless. Every fence line led to another pasture. Every trail disappeared into another section of land. I found old cattle pens, abandoned sheds, and irrigation channels that hadn't carried water in years. The reservoir itself sat near the western side of the property. A long earthen dam stretched across a valley. Weathered warning signs stood beside maintenance roads. Most of it looked forgotten. But one afternoon, while following an old fence line, I reached the top of a ridge and froze. Below me sat an entire neighborhood. Not a few houses. Hundreds. Perfect streets curved around a sparkling lake. Boat docks lined the shoreline. Golf carts moved between immaculate homes. Landscaped walking paths wrapped around the water. The contrast was almost absurd. My ranch looked like something from another century. The community looked like a luxury resort. A stone monument near the entrance read, "Silver Creek Preserve Private Community." I stared for several minutes. The development sat directly against my western boundary. The lake appeared connected to the same reservoir system I'd been examining all week. Strange, Nobody had mentioned any of this. Back at the house, I reviewed the documents the lawyer had given me. The property description was enormous. Pages of legal descriptions, survey references, boundary markers, yet almost nothing mentioned Silver Creek. That struck me as odd. A development that size should have left some paper trail. Instead, it was barely referenced. I made a mental note to ask questions later. At the time, I had bigger problems. The roof leaked. The generator barely worked. The kitchen sink drained slower than a government permit office. By the end of the week, I was standing on the porch replacing damaged boards when I heard engines approaching. Not one vehicle. 3. A black luxury SUV led the convoy. 2 more vehicles followed behind it. They rolled up my dirt driveway like they owned the place. The SUV stopped. A woman stepped out first. She looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, not a ranch. Perfect blonde hair, designer sunglasses, cream-colored jacket, not a speck of dust anywhere. Behind her came 2 men carrying leather briefcases, attorneys. I knew the type immediately. The woman walked directly toward me. No greeting, no introduction, no smile. She looked around the property as if she'd discovered a landfill. "You must be Wade Mercer." I set down my hammer. "That's me." She removed her sunglasses. "I'm Vanessa Caldwell, president of the Silver Creek Preserve Homeowners Association." So there it was, my mysterious neighbor. "What can I do for you?" I asked. Her eyes moved across the ranch house, the barn, the fences, the reservoir beyond, everything. Then she handed me a packet of papers. "You need to understand that your property has become a significant concern for our community." I looked at the stack. Violation notices, complaints, inspection requests, environmental concerns. I hadn't even finished reading the first page. Vanessa continued. "The condition of these structures negatively impacts surrounding property values." I actually laughed. The nearest house had to be more than a mile away. "You serious?" Her expression didn't change. "Completely." One of the attorneys stepped forward. "We are formally requesting corrective action." Requesting? At this stage? I looked back at Vanessa. "And if I don't?" Her smile finally appeared. Cold, practiced, dangerous. "Then we'll pursue every legal option available." She pointed toward the ranch house. "That structure is unsafe. Toward the barn. That building may violate multiple county codes. Toward the reservoir. That reservoir presents potential environmental concerns." I stared at her. She'd spent less than 5 minutes on the property, yet somehow she'd already found enough problems to fill a legal brief. "You drove all the way out here for this?" Vanessa folded her arms. "Silver Creek homeowners pay substantial amounts to protect their investments." There it was. The real reason. Not safety. Not regulations. Property values. People like her saw everything through dollar signs, including me, especially me. She looked at my worn boots, my faded work shirt, my battered pickup, and decided exactly what kind of man I was, a poor ranch owner standing in the way of wealthy people. Before leaving, she delivered one final warning. "We expect compliance, Mr. Mercer." Then she turned and walked back toward her SUV. The attorneys followed. The vehicles disappeared down my driveway in a cloud of dust. I stood alone on the porch, holding their paperwork. The anger came slowly. Not because of the threats, not because of the lawyers, because of how certain she had been. Vanessa Caldwell hadn't come here to negotiate. She hadn't come to introduce herself. She'd come because she believed I was weak. And somehow, for reasons I didn't yet understand, the president of a luxury HOA cared an awful lot about a forgotten ranch sitting miles outside her gates. As the dust settled over the driveway, I looked toward the distant water of Silver Creek Lake. Something wasn't adding up, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I started wondering what Uncle Russell had known that everyone else wanted forgotten. The next morning, I spread Vanessa Caldwell's paperwork across my kitchen table. The stack looked impressive until I actually read it. Most of the complaints were vague: possible environmental concerns, potential structural deficiencies, visual blight affecting neighboring property values. The kind of language lawyers use when they want to sound dangerous without actually proving anything. One thing stood out immediately. Every complaint mentioned the reservoir. Not the ranch house, not the fences, not the barn. The reservoir. I read the pages twice, then a third time. The same location kept appearing over and over. Reservoir access roads, reservoir maintenance concerns, reservoir liability risks. By noon, I was driving my ATV toward the old dam. The structure stretched farther than I'd realized during my first week on the ranch. Decades-old concrete spillways cut through the earthworks. Faded warning signs stood beside rusted gates. Nothing looked dangerous. Neglected, maybe, but not dangerous. What bothered me was how interested the HOA seemed to be. The lake beside Silver Creek Preserve sparkled in the distance. From where I stood, it looked connected to the same water system. That couldn't be a coincidence. I spent the afternoon examining old structures around the reservoir. Most were empty. One wasn't. A weathered maintenance shed stood half-hidden behind cottonwoods near the western edge of the property. Inside, I found old tools, broken equipment, stacks of rotting lumber. Nothing useful. At least that's what I thought. Then my boot struck something beneath the floor. Metal. I knelt down. The floorboards in one corner looked newer than the others. Not new, just newer. Recently replaced compared to the rest. Someone had intentionally covered something. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a pry bar from the workbench. 10 minutes later, the boards came up. Beneath them sat a steel box, about the size of a suitcase, locked. Dust covered everything except the latch. Someone had opened it before. Not recently, but not 100 years ago either. I loaded the box into my truck and hauled it back to the ranch house. The lock didn't survive long. Neither did my patience. When the lid finally opened, I understood immediately why Uncle Russell had hidden it. Inside were documents, hundreds of them, survey maps, property records, engineering drawings, reservoir permits, handwritten notes. The earliest documents dated back decades. Some were older than I was. Others appeared only a few years old. Uncle Russell hadn't been hoarding random paperwork. He'd been building a case against someone. For hours I sorted through files spread across my kitchen table. The deeper I dug, the stranger it became. Entire folders focused on water rights, reservoir easements, maintenance agreements, boundary surveys. Many pages contained handwritten notes in Russell's unmistakable block-letter handwriting. Dates, questions, cross-references, warnings. Then I found the envelope. My name was written across the front. Wade. Inside was a single folded sheet. I unfolded it carefully. The note contained only one sentence: "If they ever come after you, start with the water." Russell, I stared at those words for a long time. No explanation, no instructions, just a warning. And somehow he had known. He'd known someone would eventually come. He'd known someone would challenge ownership of this land. He'd known I might be the one standing here. The next morning brought the first official consequence. A county truck pulled into my driveway. Then another. 2 inspectors climbed out carrying clipboards. The older one introduced himself. County Environmental Services. The younger one avoided eye contact. We received complaints regarding possible reservoir violations. Of course they had. I looked at the paperwork. The complaint had been filed less than 24 hours after Vanessa's visit. Fast. Almost like somebody had been waiting. The inspectors spent 3 hours walking the property, taking photographs, making notes, measuring things. When they finally left, they handed me preliminary findings, possible violations, potential investigations. Nothing final. But enough to create expensive problems. Exactly what Vanessa wanted. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table surrounded by Uncle Russell's documents. The note sat directly in front of me. Start with the water. I opened another folder from the steel box, then another. Finally, near midnight, I found a thick packet labeled Reservoir Rights and Access Agreements. The pages inside were covered with legal descriptions, engineering diagrams, signatures, and references to neighboring properties. One name appeared again and again. Silver Creek Development Corporation. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, the pieces started moving. The HOA wasn't obsessed with my ranch. They were obsessed with something connected to the reservoir, something important enough to send lawyers, important enough to trigger county complaints, important enough for Uncle Russell to spend years documenting. And somewhere inside these records was the answer. I turned another page, then another. A date caught my eye. An agreement signed decades earlier, one that appeared connected directly to the lake serving Silver Creek Preserve. My heart began to pound, because whatever I was looking at, it was exactly what Uncle Russell had wanted me to find. I spent half the night reading. Most of the documents were technical: reservoir maintenance agreements, engineering reports, property descriptions that seemed written in a language only lawyers understood. But one thing became clear. Silver Creek hadn't simply been built next to my ranch. The development had depended on it. The records repeatedly referenced shared water infrastructure, access corridors, and reservoir easements. Every few pages, Uncle Russell had scribbled notes in the margins. Check expiration date, verify boundary. They know. Those last two words appeared several times. They know. Know what? I didn't have an answer. By sunrise, I had more questions than evidence. Unfortunately, Vanessa Caldwell wasn't waiting for me to catch up. 3 days later, the real attack began. A county zoning truck arrived just after breakfast, then another vehicle, then another. By noon, 4 separate inspectors had walked portions of my property. One focused on fencing, one inspected structures, one examined drainage channels, another photographed the reservoir access roads. Every visit generated paperwork. Every piece of paperwork contained deadlines. Every deadline contained penalties. The stack growing on my kitchen table was becoming dangerous. One notice demanded repairs to sections of fencing. Another claimed the ranch house might violate occupancy standards. A third cited potential drainage concerns near the reservoir. Individually, none of the complaints would destroy me. Together, they could bury me financially. That was the point. The following week brought local gossip. The Silver Creek community newsletter somehow found its way into neighboring mailboxes. According to the article, an irresponsible landowner had inherited property adjacent to the community and was neglecting critical infrastructure. My name wasn't mentioned. It didn't have to be. Everyone knew who they were talking about. The article quoted HOA President Vanessa Caldwell extensively. She described Silver Creek as a responsible community protecting environmental and property interests. Reading it made my blood boil, not because it was clever, because it was working. People believe confidence, and Vanessa had plenty of it. I needed facts, real facts, not guesses, not theories. I drove into town and made 2 phone calls. The first went to Judge Eleanor Hayes, retired county judge, property law expert. The woman had spent decades handling land disputes throughout Wyoming. Her reputation was legendary. The second call went to Tyler Boone, licensed surveyor, local, practical, and according to several people I trusted, impossible to intimidate. 3 days later, we met at the ranch. Judge Hayes arrived first, late 60s, sharp eyes, no wasted words. She spent less than 10 minutes reviewing the growing stack of county notices before setting them aside. These aren't the real problem. I frowned. What is? The reservoir. Exactly what Uncle Russell had written. Tyler Boone arrived shortly afterward carrying survey equipment and aerial maps. For the next several hours, we walked portions of the western property boundary. Tyler compared modern GPS coordinates against older survey records from Uncle Russell's files. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he stopped. Completely stopped. What? I asked. He stared across the valley toward Silver Creek Lake, then back at his equipment, then back at the lake. That can't be right. My stomach tightened. What can't? Tyler checked the coordinates again. Silence. More calculations. More measurements. Finally, he lowered the tablet. You said the HOA claims ownership of the lake? That's what everyone seems to believe. His expression changed. Not excitement. Concern. Professional concern. The kind experts get when facts refuse to cooperate. He pointed toward the water. Because according to these coordinates, that shoreline isn't where they think it is. Judge Hayes looked up immediately. What are you seeing? Tyler unfolded one of the older maps from Russell's records, then overlaid it against current survey data. The lines didn't match. Not even close. The discrepancy wasn't a few feet. It wasn't even a few yards. It was substantial. Large enough to affect ownership. Large enough to affect legal rights. Large enough to explain why Vanessa seemed terrified of my reservoir. For nearly an hour, Tyler checked and rechecked his numbers. Each calculation produced the same result. Each verification strengthened the conclusion. Finally, he looked directly at me. Wade, I need a full survey before I say anything definitive. My pulse quickened. But, he hesitated. Surveyors don't like making claims without evidence. Judges don't either. Neither does anyone who expects to defend their work in court. Still, Tyler answered, but if these historical records are accurate, the HOA may have a serious boundary problem. Judge Hayes folded her arms. How serious? Tyler stared across Silver Creek Lake. Serious enough that I think someone has spent a very long time hoping nobody would check. The room fell silent. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I wasn't the only person who thought something was wrong. A retired judge thought something was wrong. A licensed surveyor thought something was wrong. And somewhere inside Uncle Russell's mountain of documents was proof. As Tyler packed his equipment, he handed me a copy of preliminary measurements. I'll need another week for what? A complete boundary analysis. I looked at the lake again. The expensive docks, the shoreline homes, the walking paths, the perfect community Vanessa was fighting so hard to protect. Then I looked at the old maps spread across my kitchen table. The same maps Uncle Russell had spent years collecting. The same maps Tyler now believed might expose something enormous. For the first time, the balance of power shifted. Only slightly. But enough. Because Tyler Boone had just discovered something strange about Silver Creek's lake boundary. And if he was right, everything Vanessa Caldwell had built her authority on might be standing in the wrong place. The following week felt longer than the entire month I'd spent on the ranch. Tyler worked quietly, No dramatic phone calls, no bold predictions, just measurements, records, GPS data, and historical surveys. The kind of evidence that survives courtrooms. Judge Eleanor Hayes warned me repeatedly not to jump to conclusions. Facts first, she said. Then leverage. Still, I could tell even she was curious. Every time we reviewed Uncle Russell's documents, the same pattern kept appearing. Water, access, easements, boundary adjustments, and everywhere, notes written in Russell's handwriting. They built first, paperwork later. One Friday afternoon, Tyler called. I think you'd better come into town. His tone told me everything. This wasn't another update. This was an answer. An hour later, I walked into his office. Large survey maps covered an entire conference table. Modern satellite imagery sat beside historical county plats. Dozens of colored markers connected survey points across the valley. Tyler didn't waste time. I finished the boundary reconstruction. My stomach tightened. And? He slid a map toward me. This is the original Mercer property. The red boundary line wrapped around my ranch, around the reservoir, then around Silver Creek Lake. I stared. What am I looking at? The truth. Judge Hayes sat beside him, completely calm, which somehow made it feel more serious. Tyler pointed toward the lake, the shoreline, then the dam, then a maintenance road, then several utility structures. Every location sat inside the red property boundary, inside my property boundary. I looked again. Surely I was misunderstanding. Silver Creek owns the lake. Tyler shook his head. No. The homeowners think they do. They don't. Silence filled the room. Tyler tapped another document. An easement agreement dated nearly 30 years earlier. Silver Creek's original developer had negotiated temporary access rights during construction. Water use, dam access, maintenance corridors. Everything had been granted through a legal easement. Then Tyler pointed to the expiration clause. The date sat there in black ink. Clear, unmistakable. Expired. Years ago. I stared at it. The room suddenly felt smaller. You're telling me this expired and nobody renewed it? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Judge Hayes leaned forward. Legally speaking, the easement granted access. It did not transfer ownership. I looked at the map again. The implications started hitting me one piece at a time. The lake, the dam, the spillway, the maintenance roads, everything Silver Creek advertised as community amenities, everything residents paid HOA fees to maintain, everything Vanessa Caldwell acted like she controlled. None of it actually belonged to them. It sat on Mercer land. My land. I leaned back slowly. Does Vanessa know? Neither answered immediately. Then Tyler slid another folder across the table. Inside were correspondence records, letters, requests, county filings. Many carried signatures from Silver Creek officials over the years. Several contained direct references to easement renewals, applications, extension requests, legal reviews. The HOA had been discussing the issue for years. Someone knew. Someone had always known. Judge Hayes broke the silence. The question isn't whether they know. She tapped the documents. The question is how many people know. The realization hit like a freight train. Vanessa hadn't shown up because my ranch looked ugly. She hadn't launched inspections because of property values. She hadn't sent attorneys because of old fences. She was protecting a secret, a very expensive secret. The entire power structure of Silver Creek depended on nobody examining those records too closely. And now I had them. The following morning proved just how nervous that made someone. I woke to find another county notice taped to my gate. Emergency review, potential environmental enforcement, possible penalties. The language was even more aggressive than before. I laughed. For the first time since this fight started, I actually laughed. Because now I understood. Every complaint, every inspection, every threat. They weren't attacking from strength. They were attacking from fear. I drove directly to the reservoir. For nearly an hour, I walked the dam, the spillway, the maintenance road leading toward Silver Creek. Everything looked different now. Not because the land had changed, because the truth had. At the far end of the maintenance road, a white SUV appeared. Vanessa Caldwell. She stepped out before the vehicle fully stopped. No attorneys this time. No assistants. Just her. She walked toward me with forced confidence. "We need to talk." I looked around. "Funny. Last time you wanted compliance." Her jaw tightened. "This situation is becoming unnecessarily complicated." There it was. Not denial, not outrage. Complicated. She knew maybe not every detail, but enough. I said nothing. Vanessa glanced toward the reservoir, then toward the lake in the distance. For a brief second, the perfect composure cracked. I saw concern, real concern, the kind people show when they realize information is escaping their control. Finally, she spoke. "If you're considering legal action, I'd advise caution." I almost smiled. A week ago, she threatened me. Now she was advising me. The balance was shifting, slowly, but unmistakably. As Vanessa climbed back into her SUV, I watched her drive away toward Silver Creek. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I wasn't wondering why the HOA feared my property. I knew. Because Tyler Boone had confirmed the one thing Vanessa Caldwell never wanted exposed. Silver Creek Lake was never truly theirs, and if the full story came out, her authority might collapse right along with it. The smartest thing I could have done at that moment was exactly what Judge Eleanor Hayes told me to do. Nothing. At least, nothing public. I wanted to march straight into Silver Creek and demand answers. I wanted to confront Vanessa Caldwell. I wanted every homeowner to know what Tyler Boone had uncovered. Instead, Judge Hayes stopped me. "You're thinking emotionally. I've got proof. You have the beginning of proof." There was a difference, one that mattered. Because if this fight ever reached a courtroom, assumptions wouldn't win. Documents would. The next month became an exercise in patience. Every morning I worked on the ranch. Every afternoon I built a file. The first target was the lake itself. If Silver Creek had been operating on expired easements, there would be other shortcuts. Tyler believed it. Judge Hayes believed it. Now we needed evidence. I started walking. The shoreline, the maintenance roads, the utility corridors running around the reservoir. At first I noticed small things. Boat docks extending farther than county regulations allowed. Retaining walls built directly against protected shoreline zones. Private decks reaching into areas marked on older permits as public maintenance access. One violation meant little. 20 started looking like a pattern. 50 looked like negligence. Then I found the utility corridor. According to old reservoir maps from Uncle Russell's records, a buried electrical line crossed part of my property before feeding several community facilities. Clubhouse, pump station, marina lighting. I checked county records. The permits existed. The easement didn't. That discovery sent a chill through me. The utility line wasn't supposed to be there without authorization. Not legally. Not anymore. I documented everything. Photographs, coordinates, permit references, county maps. Judge Hayes insisted every piece of evidence be organized like a court exhibit. "No shortcuts," she kept saying. they'll look for mistakes. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. Another county notice arrived, then another. An environmental review, a drainage inquiry, a livestock complaint filed by an anonymous source. The timing wasn't subtle. Someone was trying to keep me busy, trying to keep me reacting, trying to stop me from digging. The strategy failed, because every complaint forced me deeper into public records, and every public record revealed something new. One afternoon, I spent 6 hours inside the county archives. Permit files filled entire boxes. Silver Creek's development history stretched back decades. Most of it looked routine. Then I started comparing approved plans against what actually existed. Several shoreline structures had never appeared on final approved drawings. Multiple dock expansions lacked modification permits. A lakeside recreation area sat outside its authorized footprint. Someone had been building first and asking questions later, exactly like Uncle Russell's notes suggested. They built first, paperwork later. The old man had been right. Again. 2 weeks later, Tyler arrived at the ranch carrying a thick folder. More survey confirmations. I flipped through the pages. Every new measurement reinforced the same conclusion. The HOA's physical infrastructure extended far beyond what its legal rights allowed. Not accidentally. Systematically. The implications were enormous. But we still weren't ready. Because evidence alone doesn't change public opinion. Stories do. And Vanessa controlled the story. At least for now. That changed when I met someone unexpected. The local newspaper had sent a reporter to investigate a dispute involving county code enforcement. Her name was Megan Foster, mid-30s, sharp, direct, the kind of journalist who listened more than she talked. She showed up at the ranch one afternoon carrying a notebook and a camera. "I've been hearing your name. Good things or bad things?" She smiled. "Depends who you ask." Fair answer. For nearly an hour she asked questions. Not about drama, not about rumors, about records, dates, permits, documents. The kinds of questions that actually mattered. When I mentioned the expired easement, she stopped writing. "Do you have proof?" Eventually. Eventually wasn't enough for publication, but it was enough to keep her interested. Before leaving, Megan looked toward Silver Creek Lake. People there seemed nervous. That caught my attention. Nervous? HOA board members don't usually call newspaper editors trying to discourage coverage. Now I was smiling, because that meant Vanessa was worried, and worried people make mistakes. As Megan drove away, I stood on the porch watching the sun reflect off the distant water. A month earlier, I'd been defending myself. Now I was building a case. The power shift wasn't visible yet. Most homeowners still believed Vanessa. Most county officials still viewed me as a problem. But underneath the surface, the balance was changing. Tyler had proven the boundaries. Judge Hayes was building the legal framework. And now a journalist had started asking questions. The first cracks were forming. I just didn't know how big they were. That answer arrived 3 days later, because Megan Foster called me late on a Thursday evening, and the first words out of her mouth were enough to stop me cold. "Wade, I think I found payments that somebody worked very hard to hide." I sat down at the kitchen table immediately. "What kind of payments?" There was a pause on the line. "The kind that don't show up where they're supposed to." That got my attention. Megan Foster wasn't someone who exaggerated. If she called after hours, she had a reason. Over the next 20 minutes, she explained what she'd uncovered. Nothing criminal, not yet, but definitely unusual. Silver Creek HOA had been paying large consulting invoices to an outside management company called Western Community Solutions. That by itself wasn't suspicious. Plenty of HOAs hire management firms. The problem was what happened next. Several of those payments appeared connected to a second consulting entity, one with no public office, no website, no employees listed, and almost no paper trail. The only name appearing repeatedly on the documents was Vanessa Caldwell, not as HOA president, as a consultant. I leaned forward. How much money are we talking about? Enough that I'd like to see more records before I print anything. That was journalist language for a lot. When the call ended, I immediately contacted Judge Hayes. Her reaction was measured, as always. Don't chase corruption yet. What? We still win this through property rights. She was right. The financial questions mattered, but the easement issue remained the foundation. If we got distracted, Vanessa would benefit. Unfortunately, Vanessa wasn't sitting still either. The next attack came through public opinion. 3 days later, my phone started ringing. Customers from town, former clients, even people I barely knew, all asking variations of the same question. What's going on with that HOA situation? At first, I didn't understand. Then I saw it. A Silver Creek community newsletter had gone viral on local social media. The article never mentioned me directly. It didn't need to. It described an irresponsible landowner attempting to exploit legal loopholes for personal profit. A man threatening families. A man trying to weaponize technical property disputes. A man motivated by greed. Anyone in the county could connect the dots. My name spread quickly. Some people believed it. Some didn't. What bothered me wasn't the criticism. It was how familiar it felt. For years after my divorce, people had looked at me and seen failure. Failed marriage. Struggling business. A middle-aged mechanic barely holding things together. Now Vanessa was selling the same story. The poor ranch owner looking for a payday. Only this time she had an audience. Judge Hayes noticed the frustration immediately. Good. I stared at her. Good? She's abandoning legal arguments and moving toward emotional ones. I hadn't thought about it that way. Why does that matter? Because facts don't scare her anymore. That stopped me. Judge Hayes continued. People attack reputations when they're losing control of evidence. The next week proved her point. More stories appeared online. Anonymous comments. Rumors. Claims that I planned to force homeowners out of Silver Creek. Claims that I wanted millions of dollars. Claims that I intended to shut down access to the lake. Most were nonsense. But nonsense spreads faster than facts, especially when people are scared. Then something unexpected happened. The smear campaign pushed more people toward Megan. Residents started contacting her, former HOA volunteers, past board members, contractors who had worked for Silver Creek, people who weren't willing to speak publicly yet, but willing to talk privately. And many of them had questions. Questions about budgets, questions about consulting expenses, questions about decisions Vanessa had made over the years. The pressure was building. Then came the confrontation. I was leaving the county records office one afternoon when Vanessa appeared beside my truck. No warning, no attorneys. Just Vanessa. She looked tired. Not physically, professionally, like someone carrying too many problems. You need to stop, oh. Her voice was calm, controlled. I unlocked the truck door. Stop what? This campaign. I almost laughed. You mean reading public records? Her expression hardened. You know exactly what I mean. No, Vanessa, I really don't. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she glanced toward the courthouse. You have no idea what you're getting involved in. That sentence told me more than she intended. Because innocent people don't say things like that. People protecting secrets do. I climbed into the truck. Before closing the door, I looked at her. Then maybe you should explain it. She didn't. She walked away. And that told me everything. That night, Megan called again. This time, her voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Excitement. I got access to more records. What kind? The kind that explain why Vanessa's so nervous. I waited. Megan lowered her voice. There are payments tied directly to her. The room suddenly felt smaller. Can you prove it? Not completely, yet. Yet. Then she added something that changed everything. I think some former board members are willing to talk. The war had shifted. This wasn't just Wade Mercer versus Silver Creek anymore. People inside the system were beginning to question it. And once insiders start talking, secrets rarely stay buried for long. The first person willing to speak wasn't who I expected. His name was Robert Kessler, a retired accountant, former Silver Creek HOA treasurer. Megan arranged the meeting at a small diner 20 miles from the community. Kessler looked nervous from the moment he sat down. Not guilty, concerned. The expression of someone who had ignored warning signs for too long. I never thought it would go this far, he said. Megan switched on a recorder. What exactly went this far? Kessler exhaled slowly. The money. For the next hour, he walked us through years of HOA financial records. At first, the issues seemed small. Consulting fees, administrative expenses, contract adjustments. Nothing dramatic. Then the pattern emerged. Every year, Silver Creek paid Western Community Solutions large management fees. Every year, those fees increased. And every year, additional consulting payments appeared under separate categories. The amounts varied. The recipient did not. Vanessa Caldwell. Not as HOA president. Not as a board member. As an independent consultant. Judge Hayes reviewed the records later that afternoon. She spent nearly 40 minutes reading silently. Then she closed the folder. She's receiving money from vendors doing business with the HOA. I nodded. That's bad? It's worse than bad. The next question was simple. Could we prove residents didn't know? Kessler answered that one. Board meeting minutes, financial summaries, annual reports. None disclosed the consulting payments. Not once. The homeowners paying monthly fees had never been informed. The conflict was no longer just about my land. Now it involved trust. Hundreds of homeowners believed Vanessa was protecting their interests. Meanwhile, she appeared to be benefiting financially from companies receiving HOA contracts. That changes people, especially homeowners, especially retirees, especially families watching every dollar. 3 days later, another former board member came forward. Then another. Not whistleblowers, not heroes, just ordinary people who had started asking questions after Megan's article about the easement dispute. One remembered budget concerns being dismissed repeatedly. Another recalled requests for independent audits being delayed. A third provided emails discussing consulting agreements that somehow never reached board review. Individually, none of it proved corruption. Together, it painted a troubling picture, and the picture kept getting worse. Meanwhile, Vanessa's behavior changed dramatically. The public attacks intensified. Social media posts appeared almost daily. Community emails warned residents about legal threats. Newsletters described outside attempts to destabilize Silver Creek. The language became increasingly desperate. One article claimed I wanted to shut down lake access entirely. Another claimed I planned to charge homeowners thousands of dollars per month. Both were lies. But fear travels quickly. The strategy might have worked if people weren't already asking questions. The problem for Vanessa was that facts had started leaking into the conversation. And facts are harder to control, especially when residents start comparing notes. One evening, Megan called with another development. "You're not going to believe this. After everything we'd uncovered, I doubted that. Try me. We obtained vendor payment records." I sat forward. "And?" "There are years where consulting payments to Vanessa exceeded her entire HOA compensation. That got my attention. Because nobody works that hard for free. And nobody hides payments unless disclosure creates problems." The next morning, Judge Hayes drafted a series of notices. Nothing aggressive, nothing threatening, just factual, professional, and devastating. Every notice contained verified information: property boundary findings, easement concerns, documentation regarding lake infrastructure. No accusations, only facts. The notices were addressed directly to homeowners, not the HOA, not Vanessa. The homeowners. Judge Hayes explained why. People deserve the truth before someone else rewrites it. Within a week, certified mail began arriving throughout Silver Creek. Hundreds of envelopes, hundreds of residents opening documents that challenged everything they believed about their community. Questions exploded almost immediately. Residents wanted answers. Board members wanted explanations. Homeowners wanted records. And for the first time since this fight began, Vanessa wasn't controlling the conversation. The phone calls started, then the emails, then requests for meetings. Some residents were angry at me. Others were angry at Vanessa. Most were simply confused. The one thing they shared was uncertainty. The certainty Vanessa had relied upon for years was disappearing. Fast. Then Tyler Boone delivered another update. His final survey certification had been approved. Every boundary, every coordinate, every easement reference, official, defensible, court-ready, the lake, the dam, the spillway, the maintenance roads, all confirmed. The documents landed like a hammer. There was no longer any serious dispute about the land, only consequences. That same afternoon, Megan forwarded me a message from a current HOA board member. The sender requested confidentiality. The final sentence stood out. "We think Vanessa has been hiding far more than financial records." I read it twice, then a third time, because suddenly the fight wasn't getting smaller. It was getting bigger. Much bigger. And as certified letters continued arriving throughout Silver Creek, one thing became impossible to ignore. The homeowners were no longer asking whether I owned the land. They were starting to ask what else Vanessa Caldwell had kept from them. The pressure inside Silver Creek reached a breaking point less than 2 weeks after the certified letters arrived. An emergency community meeting was announced. Attendance mandatory for all homeowners. The notice claimed the meeting would address misinformation regarding recent property disputes. Everyone knew exactly what that meant. By the time I arrived, the clubhouse parking lot was overflowing. Golf carts lined the sidewalks. Residents crowded around the entrance in small groups, holding copies of the documents Judge Hayes had mailed. Nobody looked relaxed. Nobody looked confident. The certainty that had defined Silver Creek was gone. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from the first time I'd seen the community. Back then, everything looked polished, controlled. Now people were whispering, arguing, comparing paperwork. Vanessa Caldwell stood at the front of the room beside several HOA board members. She wore the same composed expression she'd carried since the beginning of this fight. But it wasn't working anymore. Too many people had questions. Megan Foster sat near the back with a notebook. Tyler Boone arrived carrying survey maps. Judge Hayes took a seat quietly along the side wall. No speeches, no drama, just facts. The meeting began with Vanessa. She launched into a carefully prepared presentation. Slides appeared on large screens, charts, community photographs, property value statistics. The message was simple. Silver Creek was under attack. Outside parties were attempting to exploit technical legal issues. Residents needed to stay united. A few months earlier, the speech might have worked. Not now. Halfway through the presentation, a hand went up. An older homeowner named Diane Walker stood. Did the easement expire? The room immediately went silent. Vanessa hesitated. Only briefly. The legal interpretation of those documents remains disputed. Diane didn't sit down. That's not what I asked. The silence deepened. Vanessa repeated the same answer. This time, several residents exchanged looks. Then another homeowner stood. Tom Edwards, retired contractor. Do you or do you not control the lake property? Vanessa attempted to redirect. Tom interrupted her. People applauded. Actual applause. The balance of power inside the room shifted visibly. For years, Vanessa had controlled every discussion. Now residents were controlling her. Finally, Tyler Boone stepped forward. He unfolded one of the certified surveys, then another, then another. Large maps covered an entire wall. He spoke calmly. No accusations, no opinions, only measurements, coordinates, property boundaries, survey certifications. The evidence was impossible to ignore. The lake exists here, he pointed. The dam exists here. Another point. The maintenance corridor exists here. Another. Every location fell inside the Mercer property boundary. Every one. The room erupted. People stood. Questions flew from every direction. Vanessa attempted to regain control. She couldn't. Not anymore. Because Tyler wasn't offering theories. He was presenting certified survey data. Then Megan Foster stood. And things became much worse. She distributed copies of financial summaries, public records, vendor payments, consulting invoices. The numbers spoke for themselves. Years of payments. Years of undisclosed consulting relationships. Years of financial decisions residents knew nothing about. A woman near the front row stared at one page, then another, then looked directly at Vanessa. You were getting paid? The question echoed through the room. Vanessa tried to explain. Consulting work, industry expertise, administrative responsibilities. Nobody cared. Not because consulting work is illegal, because nobody had been told. Trust was evaporating in real time. Board members who had sat silently beside Vanessa suddenly looked uncomfortable. One began flipping through financial records. Another whispered something to a colleague. The cracks were spreading. Fast. Then came the moment that changed everything. A current board member stood. Someone who had supported Vanessa publicly for years. I never saw these payments. The room exploded again. Now the problem wasn't Wade Mercer. Now it wasn't even the easement. The problem was trust. And trust had collapsed. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Homeowners demanded independent audits, special elections, board reviews, legal opinions. Everything Vanessa had spent years controlling was slipping away. Then the doors opened. Sheriff Cole Ramsey entered. The room fell silent immediately. Not because anyone feared him, because everyone respected him. The sheriff carried a folder. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. He simply walked to the front and waited. When the room settled, he spoke. Due to multiple complaints received by county offices, a formal review process has been opened. No accusations, no conclusions, just facts. Exactly the way law enforcement prefers it. The effect was devastating. Because the sheriff's involvement made everything real. This wasn't social media anymore. This wasn't HOA politics. This was an official review. Vanessa's face changed. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely worried. Not angry, not arrogant, worried. As homeowners filed out of the clubhouse, Conversations filled the parking lot. Nobody talked about me. Nobody talked about my ranch. Nobody even talked much about the easement. They talked about Vanessa, about the money, about the missing disclosures, about what else they hadn't been told. The narrative had completely flipped. A few months earlier, I was the outsider threatening Silver Creek. Now Silver Creek residents were questioning the person who claimed to protect them. As I walked toward my truck, Megan caught up with me. "You realize what just happened, right?" I looked back at the clubhouse. The arguments, the confusion, the uncertainty. Vanessa lost the room. Megan nodded. "More than that." "What?" She glanced toward the board members leaving through a side exit. "I think she just lost control of the entire community. And if Megan was right, the next battle wouldn't be fought inside an HOA meeting. It would be fought in public, with lawyers, records, and decades of evidence finally coming into the light." The county hearing was scheduled 3 weeks after the Silver Creek meeting. By then, the conflict had grown far beyond an HOA dispute. News crews were covering it. County officials were reviewing documents. Homeowners were organizing independent committees. And for the first time in years, Vanessa Caldwell wasn't directing the conversation. She was reacting to it. The hearing took place inside the county administration building. Every seat was filled. Residents lined the walls. More waited outside. Judge Eleanor Hayes wasn't acting as counsel, but her presence carried weight. Tyler Boone arrived with certified survey records. Megan Foster carried enough documents to fill a small filing cabinet. Sheriff Cole Ramsey sat near the rear of the room, observing. Nobody knew exactly how the day would end, but everyone understood one thing. The truth was finally going on the record. County attorneys began with the property question. Simple, direct, ownership. Tyler Boone testified first. He walked officials through the original Mercer property boundaries. Historical plats, GPS confirmations, survey certifications. Every measurement pointed to the same conclusion. Silver Creek Lake, the dam, the spillway, the utility corridors, the maintenance roads, all sat within property controlled by the Mercer family. Not the HOA, not the developer, not Silver Creek. The room remained surprisingly quiet. The shock had already happened weeks earlier. Now people wanted confirmation, and Tyler provided it. Then came the easement documents. Those created a different reaction. Because the expiration date wasn't disputed, it wasn't unclear, it wasn't hidden. It sat plainly inside the original agreement. The easement had expired years ago. No renewal existed. No replacement agreement existed. No valid extension existed. The county attorney asked the obvious question. Was the HOA aware of this issue? That question shifted attention toward Vanessa. Her attorneys objected repeatedly. But documents have a way of speaking for themselves. Meeting minutes, legal correspondence, historical reviews. Several records showed discussions about easement concerns over the years. Not detailed discussions, not public discussions, but enough. Enough to establish awareness. Enough to make residents uncomfortable. Then Megan Foster presented her findings. The room changed immediately. Because land disputes are technical, money is personal. Financial records appeared on projection screens, consulting payments, vendor contracts, management fees, invoices, board disclosures, or more accurately, the lack of disclosures. The numbers were difficult to ignore. Years of payments connected to Vanessa. Years of consulting arrangements never clearly communicated to homeowners. The issue wasn't whether consulting work existed. The issue was transparency. Homeowners began whispering, then arguing quietly among themselves, then comparing records. The trust deficit widened with every page. But the biggest revelation arrived unexpectedly. It came from a box of documents recovered from Uncle Russell's steel lockbox. One file had been overlooked during the earlier stages of the dispute. Judge Hayes had reviewed it only days before the hearing. Now it sat on the table in front of county officials. The document traced the original design of Silver Creek. Not the community. The lake. The development had marketed Silver Creek Lake as a central community asset from the beginning. Brochures, advertisements, property packages, investor presentations, all promised lake access, lake recreation, lake views, lake amenities. There was only one problem. The developer never actually owned the lake infrastructure being advertised. The project depended entirely on temporary rights granted through the Mercer easement. The room fell silent. Not a dramatic silence. A stunned silence. The kind that happens when hundreds of people realize the foundation of a story they've believed for years isn't true. The county attorney reviewed the file twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked toward the commissioners. The lake amenities were marketed as permanent community assets. Nobody disagreed, yet those amenities depended on property rights controlled by another party. Still, nobody disagreed. The implications spread across the room. Every dock, every walking trail, every lakeside recreation feature. Everything homeowners believed belonged to the HOA. Everything used to justify fees. Everything used to support property values. Depended on land rights Vanessa never actually controlled. Several residents looked physically ill. Others simply looked angry. Vanessa remained silent. Her attorneys handled most responses now. The confidence she'd displayed during our first meeting at the ranch was gone. Completely gone. By late afternoon, county officials reached their preliminary conclusions. Ownership claims supported by Mercer records were valid. Survey findings were credible. The easement expiration was established. Financial reviews would continue. Additional investigations would proceed separately. The hearing ended without fireworks, without dramatic speeches, without a final verdict. Because real legal battles rarely end that way. But the damage was done. The facts were now public, officially public. No newsletter could undo that. No social media campaign could erase it. No amount of HOA authority could put the documents back in the box. As residents slowly filed out, conversations filled the hallways. Not about me, not even about Vanessa. About what happened next. One homeowner finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. What if Mercer enforces his rights? Another answered immediately. What if he doesn't? I heard both. And honestly, I wasn't sure which possibility scared them more. Because after months of conflict, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The ground beneath Silver Creek's most valuable assets belonged to me, and now everyone knew it. The only question left was what I intended to do with that power. For weeks after the hearing, that question followed me everywhere, at the feed store, at the mechanic shop. Even in town restaurants, some people expected revenge. Others expected a payday. A few assumed I would shut down access to the lake entirely and force Silver Creek into a legal nightmare. Legally, I had options. Plenty of them. Judge Eleanor Hayes laid them out during a meeting at the ranch. I could demand immediate renegotiation of every expired easement. I could restrict access to infrastructure crossing my property. I could challenge utility corridors. I could force years of litigation. Every option favored me. For the first time since Vanessa Caldwell stepped onto my porch, the leverage belonged entirely to me. But something kept bothering me. The homeowners weren't the people who came after me. Most of them had bought houses believing the documents they were shown. They hadn't hidden easements. They hadn't filed complaints against my ranch. They hadn't spent years ignoring legal realities. Vanessa had. The HOA leadership had. The people living beside the lake were victims of the same deception. Judge Hayes nodded when I finally said it out loud. Then don't punish the wrong people. That became the foundation of everything that followed. Negotiations began less than a month later. Not lawsuits, negotiations. County officials helped facilitate discussions between property owners, homeowner representatives, and legal counsel. For the first time, conversations focused on solutions instead of accusations. The process wasn't easy. Nothing involving land rights ever is. But once the facts became impossible to deny, progress came surprisingly fast. The final agreement took nearly 3 months. When it was finished, Silver Creek residents received exactly what they wanted most: stability. Long-term access agreements were established for the lake, dam, spillway, maintenance roads, and utility corridors. Homeowners retained use of the amenities that made their community valuable. The Mercer property rights remained fully intact. Future access would be governed by transparent agreements rather than forgotten easements. Everyone finally knew where they stood. Financial investigations continued separately. Those produced consequences of their own. Independent auditors confirmed years of undisclosed consulting relationships. Board reviews uncovered multiple disclosure failures. State agencies opened inquiries into financial practices connected to HOA operations. Vanessa Caldwell resigned before the process finished. Officially, she described it as a personal decision. Nobody believed that. By then, her authority had evaporated. The residents she once controlled no longer trusted her. The board members who once defended her had stopped returning her calls. The same community she claimed to protect voted overwhelmingly to remove her influence from future HOA governance. The fall wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was public. Months later, Silver Creek elected an entirely new board. One committed to transparency. Independent audits became standard. Financial disclosures became mandatory. Community meetings became open. The secrecy that allowed the problem to grow disappeared. Megan Foster's reporting won regional recognition. Her articles exposed not only the easement issue, but the broader failures that had allowed it to remain hidden for so long. Tyler Boone's surveys became the foundation for updated county records. Judge Hayes gained the quiet satisfaction of seeing another property dispute resolved through facts instead of ego. As for me, life changed in ways I never expected. The ranch stopped feeling like an unwanted inheritance. It became home. The old house was repaired. The fences were rebuilt. The neglected reservoir received long overdue maintenance. For the first time in years, the property looked alive again. One evening near the end of summer, I stood on the ridge overlooking the water. The same ridge where I'd first seen Silver Creek. The lake reflected the setting sun. Boats moved across the surface. Families gathered near the shoreline. Children fished from docks that now existed under legitimate agreements instead of assumptions. The conflict was over. The community survived. The ranch survived. The truth survived. A few days later, I visited Uncle Russell's grave. The marker stood beneath a cottonwood overlooking part of the reservoir he had spent decades protecting. I brought copies of the final settlement. Not because he could read them, because it felt right. For years, people had called him stubborn, difficult, obsessed with old paperwork. Now I understood what he'd been fighting for. Not money, not power, not even land. Accountability. The simple idea that ownership matters, that records matter, that truth matters. I stood there for a long time before finally speaking. You were right. The wind moved through the grass. The reservoir shimmered beyond the hill. And for the first time since inheriting 1,500 acres that nobody wanted, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind that comes when a fight ends the right way. Not with destruction, not with revenge, with justice. Vanessa Caldwell lost the power she abused. Silver Creek gained the transparency it deserved, and the land remained exactly where it belonged. Sometimes winning isn't about taking everything from the people who wronged you. Sometimes it's about making sure the truth finally owns the ground beneath their feet.
The biggest lesson from the story is that patience matters more than anger. Wade could have reacted the moment he discovered the truth about the land and the lake. Instead, he took the harder road. He gathered records, listened to people who knew the law, and let the facts speak for themselves. In the end, the goal wasn't to destroy the community, it was to protect what was rightfully his, while giving honest people and fair path to forward. That's lesson worth remembering in the world where so many problems get louder before they get better. There's something powerful about standing your ground without losing your character. Property can be inherited, money can come and go, and integrity is something you have to choose every day. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm, stay steady, and refuse to let the truth be buried. Now, I'd love to hear from you if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where you had to stand up for yourself in the right way. Drop a comment below and type yes if you believe true perseverance still matter. And if stories like this remind you that ordinary people can make a difference through patience, obedience, and quiet courage, consider subscribing. We've got many more HOA, ranch, land, and small town justice story coming your way, and we'll be glad to have you along for the journey.